Okay, I'm gonna read part of the introduction to the history of the Pope by Ludwig Pasteur. Okay, introduction. I don't know. I'll see how far I get. I don't know how far I'm gonna get. I'm just going to read about roughly 10 minutes, and then there's also like little notes, like footnotes. So I might, after I read my 10 minutes, go back to those footnotes just to see what they say. All right. All right. Introduction: Literary Renaissance in Italy and the Church. With the exception of the period which witnessed the transformation of the pagan into the Christian world, the history of mankind hardly offers one more striking than that of the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern times. One of the most powerful elements in this epoch of marked contrast was the exhaustive appreciation and extension of the study of the ancient world, commonly known as the Renaissance, or the new birth of classical antiquity. This movement naturally began in Italy, where the memory of the classic past had never been wholly effaced, and with it opens a new epoch. The object of this work is not to demonstrate the origin and development of this revolution, affected in science, poetry, art, and life. The historian of the popes is only concerned with the Renaissance insofar as it comes in contact with the Church and the Holy See. To thoroughly and correctly appreciate this relation, we must bear in mind that in this movement, which began in the realm of literature, there were from the two, I'm sorry, there were from the first two conflicting currents discernible, and more or less in its gifted founders, Petrarch and Boccaccio. Like the author of the Divine Comedy, Petrarch took his stand upon the Church and succeeded in combining enthusiastic admiration for classical antiquity with devout reverence for Christianity. His passionate love for the an- antique did not make him forget the sublimity of the Christian mysteries. On the contrary, the poet repeatedly and energetically declared that he looked on the gospel as higher than all the wisdom of the ancients. Quote, "We may," he writes to his friend Giovanni Colonna, "love the schools of the philosophers and agree with them only when they are in accord with the truth, and when they do not lead us astray from our chief end. Should anyone attempt to do this, were he even Plato or Aristotle, Varro or Cicero, we must firmly and constantly despise and reject him. Let no subtlety of arguments, no grace of speech, no renown ensnare us. They were but men, learned so far as mere human erudition can go, brilliant in eloquence, endowed with the gifts of nature, but deserving of pity inasmuch as they lacked the highest and ineffable gift. As they trusted only in their own strength and did not strive after the true light, they often fell like blind men. Let us admire their intellectual gifts, but in such wise as to reverence the creator of these gifts. Let us have compassion on the errors of these men, while we congratulate ourselves and acknowledge that out of mercy, without merit of our own, we've been we've been favored above our forefathers by him, who has hidden his secrets from the wise and graciously manifested them to the little ones. Let us study philosophy so as to love wisdom. The real wisdom of God is Christ. In order to attain true philosophy, we must love and reverence him above all things. We must first be Christians. Then we may be what we will. We must read philosophical, poetical, and historical works in such a manner that the gospel of Christ shall ever find an echo in our hearts. Though it alone can we welcome, wise and happy. Without it, the more we have learned, the more ignorant and unhappy shall we be. On the gospel alone, as upon the one immovable foundation, can human diligence build all true learning. In justification of his love for the philosophers and poets and of antiquity, Petrarch repeatedly appeals to St. Augustine, whose tearful confessions were among his favorite books. Quote, So great a doctor of the church, he says, was not ashamed to let himself be guided by Cicero, although Cicero pursued a different end. Why indeed should he be ashamed? No leader is to be despised who points out the way of salvation. I do not mean to deny that in the classical writers there is as much to be avoided, but in Christian writers also there are many things that may mislead the unwary reader. St. Augustine himself, in laborious works, with his own hand rooted the weeds out of the rich harvest field of his writings. In short, these books are rare that can be read without danger, unless the light of divine truth illuminates us and teaches us what is to be chosen and what is to be avoided. If we follow that light, we may go on our way with security. Petrarch never flinched from expressing his devotion sentiments. He repeatedly showed himself the apologist of Christianity, and on the occasion of his solemn crowning at the Capitol, went to the Basilica of St. Peter to lay his wreath of laurels on the altar of the Prince of the Apostles. Yet Petrarch did not escape the leaven of his age, or the influence of the dangerous elements of antiquity. He often succumbed to the sensual passions so faithfully depicted in his works. Quote, on contempt of the world, unquote, his inordinate love of preferment in another blot upon his stormy life, and we discover in him not a few traits at variance with his devout Christian intuitions. Among these are his scornful attitude towards scholastic theology, which had indeed much degenerated, and his craving for fame. On this point we shall judge him the more leniently if we reflect that even the heart of Dante, whose immortal poem upholds the Christian view of this nothingness of human glory, was not impervious to this weakness. Still, it is sad to see a man so eminent in intellectual gifts as Petrarch yearning after crowns of laurel, royal favors, and popular ovations, and pursuing the phantom of glory in the courts of profligate princes. Undoubtedly, this ardent passion was for renown, to which the Christian conscience of the poet opposed such an inefficacious resistance, must be considered as a taint of heathenism. In the old classical authors, especially in Cicero, this ideal of human fame was so vividly presented to the mind of Petrarch that at times it entirely eclipsed the Christian ideal. But he has one uncontested excellence. Never does a wanton or sensual thought mar the pure silver ring of his sonnets. In this respect, the most marked contrast exists between him and his friend and contemporary Boccaccio, whose writings breathe an atmosphere of heathen corruption. The way in which this great master of style delineation of character sets at naught all Christian notions of honor and decency is simply appalling. His idol Amito reeks with the profligacy of the ancient world and preaches pretty plainly the gospel of free love. In his satire Corbaccio, or The Labyrinth of Love, displayed the most revolting cynicism. A critic of no severe stamp declares that even the modern naturalistic writer can hardly outbid the defilement of this lampoon. And the most celebrated of all Boccaccio's works, the Decameron, is a presentation of purely heathen principles and unrestrained gratification of passions. A modern literary historian says that the provocation, without the possibility of excuse, in the prevalent immorality of the times and the unchaining of all evil passions caused by the plague, their effect is all the more dangerous from the genuine wit with which the writer describes the triumph of the cunning, whether over honesty, simplicity, or narrow-minded selfishness. In his stories, Boccaccio takes especial delight in heaping ridicule and contempt on ecclesiastes, monks, and nuns, and with the polished irony representing them as the quintessence of all immorality and hypocrisy. And yet, Boccaccio is no unbeliever or enemy of the church. In his insolent language regarding ecclesiastical personages, and I have a problem doing 4-syllable words or 3-syllable words. Personages is by no means the outcome of a mind essentially hostile to the church, and none of his contemporaries considered it as such. A preacher of penance who visited Boccaccio in the year 1361 reproached him bitterly with the immortality of his writings. I said immortality, I meant immorality. So let me read that again. A preacher of penance who visited Boccaccio in the year 1361 reproached him bitterly with the immorality of his writings, but not with their disloyalty. The compiler of the Decameron was never, even in his most careless days, an unbeliever, and in later life, after his conversion, the childlike piety of his nature reasserted itself. He eagerly embraced every opportunity of manifesting his faith and warning others against the perusal of the impure writings, which caused him such deep regret. The dolence of former days with his old classical gods was quite at an end, and we have his assurance that he did not look upon learning as antagonistic to faith, but at the same time he would rather renounce the former than the latter. His will also bears witness to his piety. Boccaccio hereby leaves the most precious of his possessions, his library, to the Augustin friar and professor of theology, Martiano da Signa, on condition that he should pray for his soul. And after Martino's death, he desires that the books should become the property of the monastery of Santo Spirito and be always accessible to the monks. He wishes that his last resting place should be in the Augustinian church of Santo Spirito at Florence, or if death should overtake him at Sertaldo in the Augustinian church of Saints Philip and James in that town. The positions taken up by these two founders and pioneers of the Renaissance in regard to the church was therefore not by any means a hostile one, and according the attitude of the popes towards them was throughout friendly. Boccaccio went 3 times as ambassador from Florentines to the papal court, and was always well received there. All the popes from Benedict XII to Gregory XI showed Petrarch the greatest favor, and Clement VI delivered the great poet from pecuniary embarrassments and procured for him the independence needed for his intellectual labors. It is therefore not correct to look on the movement known as the Renaissance, the literary manifestation of which is humanism, as in its origin and its whole scope directed against the church. On the contrary, the true Renaissance, the study of the past and thoroughly Christian spirit, was in itself a legitimate intellectual movement, fruitful in fresh results alike for secular and spiritual science. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to go back to the notes. We haven't finished the introduction. I'm just on page 7 of the introduction, but I want to go back to see. There's some notes here that I might want to look at. See if I want to. Let's see. All right. So the first thing I want to say is I knew this, but oh wait, I didn't know this. Hold on, where's that note from? It says right here, let me see this right. The assertion lately repeated by Courtine and Paulson to the fact that Petrarch was a priest is erroneous. He'd only received minor orders. The passage quoted by Courtine from the work De Auto Religios proves nothing, for Divinius Laudes Antique, I don't know the Latin, quod Deum Celebrare, does not mean to say Mass, but refers to the breviary in the office and choir. All right, so he's arguing that Petrarch was not a priest. Okay. Another note says that Giovanni Boccaccio endeavors as much as possible to excuse. I said, hold on. I kind of messed that up. I think the authors are saying that his notes are saying that the endeavors as much as possible to excuse Boccaccio, but admits that he cannot be washed quite clean. That's not really a point. I just skipped that note. You can. I don't care.
Are you recording?
All right. With regard to the art of Renaissance, to which a special chapter will be devoted in a future volume of this work, the Dominican friar A.M. Wise very justly observes, quote, an absolute and indiscriminate condemnation of the Renaissance as a whole of everything connected with its art cannot possibly be just. To condemn the Renaissance in general with the severity exercised by some of our best brothers in arms, no doubt speaking from the full conviction, is a thing that cannot be justified. Okay. All right, that's my last note. So I'm going to end this, and then we'll start on page 7 tomorrow, or whenever.